Myths and Music, Black Magic Book 2, written and narrated by Whitney Metz. Dedicated to the memory of Dino, who taught me the complexities of the language of chickens. Chapter 1. Green. Ben Black, who had, up until a couple of days ago, gone by the name of Ben Harrison, sat in his truck staring out at the endless stretch of ocean before him. The truck was parked in a small gravel area behind the beach house that he had once stayed in with his girlfriend, Carrie. Looking out at the water, he could see Carrie coaxing him into the waves, see the two of them running, splashing, and laughing until they were both shivering too much to continue. He had tried to avoid coming back to this place, because he knew how much it would hurt being here without Carrie. But he needed to get to the next house up the beach, and from the road, that house didn't seem to exist. He had driven in circles for half an hour, looking for a side road or a driveway or hell, a damn footpath that could possibly lead to it. There was nothing. No sign that there even was a house there. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He came back here. Ben knew for a fact that you could get to the house from here because Carrie had done it. He would walk up the shoreline until he found the cliff where the house stood, overlooking the water. He would follow in Carrie's footsteps, as he had been trying to do ever since she disappeared. When they were here before, Ben hadn't known about the house, hadn't known where Carrie went that morning. At the time, he only knew that he woke up and she wasn't in the bed beside him, and that he then found her walking on the beach. He had learned a lot of things since then, including the fact that she had kept quite a few secrets from him. Secrets like the woman who lived in the house he was here to find. He had found out that Carrie wasn't exactly the person he had believed her to be. Then again, he wasn't the person he had believed himself to be either. It had been just over 2 weeks since Carrie disappeared, and since then, it seemed that Ben's life had gotten progressively more insane every day. Most of this insanity had been terrifying. Some of it had been wonderful. And then there was some that had been just plain weird. The weird insanity reached its apex shortly after Ben left Jacob Weston's house. After his stay with Jacob, during which he learned all about nature magic and his own innate connection to the other side, Ben had become acutely aware that his time to save Carrie was running out. He began to fear that Carrie would be dead before he reached Camille, who, he was told, was the only person who could help her. He had decided that, despite his exhaustion, he was going to drive straight through the first night. He drove for hours. There were few other vehicles on the road so late at night, and the moon was nothing but a tiny sliver in the sky, offering little light. In the darkness, all the scenery looked the same, and after a while, he began to feel that he was not truly moving at all. Just when he had started to think that he couldn't stand another second of staring at empty expanses of blacktop, he passed a sign for a state forest. Jacob Weston had taught him about drawing energy from agency, more commonly known as Mother Earth, and he could definitely use some energy right now. He argued with himself over whether it would really be worth the extra time, but ultimately decided that it was. He was in serious danger of falling asleep at the wheel. Besides, maybe with a little extra juice he could reach Carrie long enough to get a few answers out of her. He wanted to know what he was walking into with Camille, but more importantly, he wanted to know if Carrie would make it long enough for him to get there. He took the exit and followed the signs down a road that was lined on both sides by huge and ancient-looking trees. He parked his truck in a rocky wide spot along the road and then walked deep into the forest, splitting off from the marked trail because Jacob had also taught him that the most powerful places have ways of hiding themselves from people who don't belong there. It was impossible for him to see where he was going in the scant moonlight, but he didn't really need to see anyway. He knew by the way the forest felt around him. It was leading him in the right direction. He moved on through the woods until he found himself standing beneath an enormous tree. Aside from Deondot, the tree Jacob had taken him to, it was the most impressive he had ever seen. Ben was willing to bet there was a fair amount of Agency's power running through those gnarled old branches. In fact, he knew there was. He could feel it. He walked up to the tree and placed his hand gently against the bark, as he had so many times at Deondot. Having introduced himself to this tree, he chose a comfortable position at its base and sat down with his back against the trunk. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the chain that hung around his neck. The chain held the amulet Carrie gave him the night she disappeared, and a crow-shaped bead that Jacob carved from a small piece of wood from Diondot. He took the bead in his hand and instantly felt it drawing energy up from the ground through the old tree's roots and into his body. The power here wasn't nearly as strong as it was on Jacob's piece of sacred land, but it was certainly better than nothing. Ben felt the power of the earth flowing into him, washing away his exhaustion and filling him with life. He sat there, absorbing Agency's energy and letting it reawaken his tired muscles until he felt filled to the brim with pulsating life force. Then he opened his fingers and slid Carrie's amulet into his palm. He squeezed it tight, feeling every curve of its surface and the subtle energy within it. He conjured an image of Carrie's face in his mind, picturing every minute detail. The image had to be strong if it was going to be enough to allow him to connect with her. Crossing over to that other plane of existence was something Ben had only realized he could do a couple of days ago. He still wasn't very good at it, but he was learning, and the influx of power from the earth made it much easier. He had felt like it nearly killed him when he tried to do it earlier that night. This time the transition was quick and smooth. Almost instantly he felt the world shift and then opened his eyes in a place that was no longer dappled with faint moonlight, but was instead shrouded in that oppressive darkness and thick suffocating fog. He focused on the thought of Carrie and sought her out with his mind. After a few moments she appeared there before him, looking clearer, brighter than she had the last time he tried this. He could make out all of the features of her face, whereas before she had appeared as more of a vague outline in the dark. It seemed he was getting better at this. He gave himself a mental pat on the back. His pride at this accomplishment evaporated when he registered Carrie's appearance. Now that he could see her clearly, he understood why he felt such a sense of urgency about her situation. She was barely recognizable as the girl he had known just a couple of weeks ago. She looked gaunt, all of her bones protruding to the point that he could see them through her clothes. Her skin was so pale that it looked almost blue, and her lips were cracked and bleeding. The worst part, though, was her eyes. They looked huge in her too thin face, and they held an expression of utter despair that tore at Ben's heart. "Hey," she said, giving her best attempt at a smile. "Hey," Ben replied. "Listen, I want you to know that I'll get you out of here soon, okay? I promise." She shook her head slowly, staring down at her hands. "Don't you understand? It's my fault that this happened. I fucked up, Ben, and I'm paying for it. I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay with is you paying for it. I can't have your death on my hands." She looked at him with those huge, pained eyes and begged, "Please, just leave me here and go back to your life." Tears began to spill down her cheeks. "I love you, and I'm so sorry for all of this, but please, just go." "No," he stated simply, and she looked a little surprised by the assertiveness in his voice. He made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sigh and said, "You know, I've let you talk me into a lot of shit since we met. And the truth is, more often than not, I ended up being glad that I did. We've done things together that I never thought I would do. And most of it was great." He smiled at her. "But not this time, Carrie. You're not talking me into leaving you here. I don't care what you did. You don't deserve to be here. And I'm going to do whatever I have to help you. And you know what? If I die trying, then that's my call to make, not yours. So you have two choices. You can either tell me what you know and maybe improve my chances of making it through this, or I can do it without you." She smiled at him, but her eyes were still shining with tears. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you put yourself through this for me after I lied and kept secrets and—" She broke eye contact. "And used you. I fully intend for us to have a nice long conversation about that later. But right now, all that matters to me is that I don't want to live my life without you. That's why. Now, are you going to help me figure this out or not?" She laughed lightly and without humor, then answered, "Yeah, okay." wiping her hands across her eyes and face. "Great," Ben said. "Why don't you start by telling me why you flipped out when I said I was going to see Camille?" "Because she's dangerous," Carrie answered. "You can't trust her." "Yeah, that's what the Summerses said too, but—" She cut him off. "You talked to Michael and Janine?" "Yeah," Ben answered. "And I know that you and Janine had a thing and all that, and I don't care." Carrie let out a laugh, a real laugh. To Ben, the sound was like coming home. "Thank you," she said, "but that's not why I was asking." "Oh," Ben answered embarrassedly. Carrie didn't seem to notice his discomfort. "What all did they tell you about Camille?" He shrugged. "I mean, Janine said that Camille was the one who gave you the book, and that she was the only one who could help you because it was her spell that you were using when this happened." "What else?" Carrie insisted. Ben had been pretty stressed at the time, not to mention dying from some kind of crazy demonic infection, so he couldn't be sure, but he didn't remember anything else that seemed relevant. "Janine said that she was the one who told you about Camille in the first place. Michael seemed pretty pissed about that." He paused to think for a moment. "That was it, really, at least as far as I can remember. Why?" Carrie looked disappointed. "I don't know. I knew that she and Michael didn't get along, but I always thought it was just that he didn't approve of her methods. The last time I talked to her, though, I got the feeling there was something else." "Something like what?" Carrie shook her head. "I don't know. I was hoping maybe Michael told you." Ben could feel the trace of a memory of something Jacob had said to him tickling at the back of his mind. Something about Michael? He couldn't quite get a hold of the thought, though, and he could feel his grasp on this reality starting to slip. It seemed that, even with the influx of power from the earth, he was still using up his energy faster than it could refill. "Afraid not," Ben said. And then, "I think I'm running out of time here. Is there anything else you can tell me that might help?" Carrie shrugged and answered, "Not much. Just that Camille is very powerful. I think maybe even more so than she lets on." She scoffed. "Janine tried to warn me about this, and I didn't listen. Don't make the same mistake I did. Camille always has her own agenda. Don't doubt that for a second. If she agrees to help you, it's because there's something in it for her, too." Ben wondered what exactly that meant. What had Carrie done for her? But he knew that was a longer conversation than he had time for right now. "I'll be careful," he assured her. "I promise." He held his hand up to Carrie's cheek and tried to remember what it had been like to touch her. She closed her eyes and smiled, and he knew she was doing the same. "I have to go now." She nodded. "I love you, Ben, and I'm so sorry. For everything. I never wanted to drag you into this. I hope you believe that." "I do." Then Carrie faded away, and Ben was back in the forest under the old tree. As he returned to his body, he realized that he had been there for some time. It had been pitch dark when he arrived, and now the sun was high in the sky. He guessed it to be mid-morning. On the upside, that meant that his abilities were getting stronger. Forest or no forest, he was fairly certain that just a couple of days before, he never would have been able to stay on the other side so long before getting pulled back. On the downside, he still had a long way to go, and he had lost several hours of driving time. He stood and rushed back in the direction of the parking area. As he was making his way through the trees, he heard a familiar sound. He stopped dead in his tracks and listened, looking up into the branches. "Luna?" he asked, watching for any sign of movement above him. She called back in response. Ben laughed, happy to know that the crow who had saved his life was still watching out for him. He had thought that, now that he was able to contact Carrie on his own, her job was done. It occurred to him then that he had forgotten to mention her to Carrie. Oddly, Carrie had made no mention of her either. He wondered, for the first time, if maybe Carrie wasn't really the one who had sent the bird after all. He heard a fluttering in the branches and finally caught a glimpse of shiny black that moved to a tree a little further away, in the opposite direction from his truck. Luna called out again. "What's the matter?" Ben asked. "Is somebody stuck in a well?" She called once more, apparently not amused by his sense of humor, and moved a little further away again. He didn't feel like he had time to deal with whatever this was, but he also knew that he owed her. So he sighed, what the hell, and followed her deeper into the forest. It was hard for Ben to keep track of her. She stayed high up in the tall trees and moved quickly from one to the next as he trailed behind her. He had to keep stopping every couple of minutes to wait for her to call out again. Each time she did, he thought she sounded vaguely irritated by his lollygagging. They moved into a thicker part of the forest, full of smaller trees and dense underbrush. The leaves blocked out most of the sunlight, making it look almost like it was night again, and the small shrubs and vines caught around Ben's feet, making him stumble as he tried to keep up with Luna. But he pushed forward, head down, following her only by the sound of her wings and occasional caws. At last she stopped moving, and Ben stepped forward into an open area where the sun shone down through the leaves in alternating green and golden beams. He paused for a moment with his hands on his knees to catch his breath. When he lifted his head, standing just a few feet in front of him was a huge snow-white wolf. Ben gasped and stepped back, tripping over his own feet and stumbling backward until his back struck the trunk of a tree. Hey, it's okay," he cooed, slowly scooting around the tree without taking his eyes off the wolf. "I'm not going to hurt you." No shit, Ben thought to himself. He'd been in one fight in his entire life. He was 6 years old at the time, and it had resulted in him sitting in the dirt whimpering while the other kids stood over him and laughed. The idea that there was anything he could do to hurt this creature was ridiculous to the point of hilarity. The wolf knew it, too. He lowered his head and began to growl low in his throat. "What the fuck, Luna?" Ben hissed at the trees above him. "I thought we were friends." She made not even a peep in response. He slowly began backing away, but with each step the wolf moved forward, keeping pace with him. Then the animal stopped and bent his back leg slightly. For a second, Ben thought he was going to sit down, but then he realized what was actually happening. No, he screamed and turned to run. But the wolf was already airborne, and a split second later Ben was slammed to the ground. The wolf's paws and the sharp claws at the ends of them pressed into his shoulder blades, and the wolf's breath was hot on the back of his neck. Then something shifted. He felt the weight on his back lessen by at least half, and he no longer felt the claws digging into his flesh. The deep rasping growl became high tinkling laughter. The breath was still on his neck, but now it was accompanied by lips leaving a trail of kisses along his neck and shoulders. "Fucking hell," Ben shouted in shock and confusion. He rolled his body over, trying to tip the thing that had been a wolf off him. As he did this, the thing, which he could now see looked like a beautiful woman, lifted up easily onto her knees so that, rather than being thrown off, she just ended up sitting on the front of Ben's body rather than the back. She smiled mischievously at him as he stared up at her in disbelief. Then she leaned down to kiss him on the mouth. Ben turned his head and put his hand up, pushing her back. Again, the not-wolf easily kept her balance and remained sitting atop his midsection. She gave Ben an exaggerated pouty face at this rejection and then laughed again. Ben pushed himself up onto his elbows and scooted awkwardly backward, fighting his way out from under her. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, noticing now that she looked suspiciously like Carrie. Specifically, she looked like Carrie had the night they met. This creature was wearing almost exactly the costume Carrie had been wearing when Ben first saw her. "A friend," the creature almost sang in response. "What do you want?" Ben demanded. "And why do you look like my girlfriend?" "Is that a pickup line?" she asked innocently, folding one leg up and resting her head on her bent knee. Ben jumped to his feet and waved an angry finger at her, immediately feeling like he was making a complete ass of himself. "I'm serious," he yelled. "What the fuck is going on here?" The girl sighed dramatically and said, Fine, I'll answer your questions. Who I am is rather complicated. We'll come back to that one. What I want is to make you a proposition. And as far as why I look like your girlfriend." Right before Ben's eyes, the girl who looked like Carrie's Halloween costume transformed into a man wearing an expensive-looking suit. That's just because I wanted to have a little fun before we got down to business. The man straightened his tie and asked, "Is this more to your liking?" At first glance, Ben thought that, had it not been for the small scraps of greenery tangled in the man's hair, he could have been any one of his former co-workers. Upon closer inspection, though, Ben realized that there was a look of amusement in the guy's eyes and an odd, exaggerated quality to his posture. He reminded Ben of a little kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. The guy, or whatever he was, had clasped his hands behind his back and was pacing determinedly back and forth with a stern look on his face. Not dress-up either, Ben thought. It's a play. He's playing the part of a businessman. The guy turned to Ben with raised eyebrows, and Ben realized that he was waiting for an answer to the question that Ben had assumed was rhetorical. Yeah, that's good," Ben responded. "Good," the guy said, with a joyful smile. Ben suspected that his comment had been taken as a positive critique of this portrayal, rather than a simple statement that he liked this look better than the faux Carrie one. The guy seemed to realize that he had broken character and put his serious expression back on. "Good," he repeated, without his former enthusiasm. "Let's get to it then." The guy mimed pulling up a chair, but since there was no chair, he simply sat cross-legged on the ground in front of Ben. When Ben only stood there staring at him, he made an impatient sweeping gesture with his hand, which Ben recognized to mean that he was supposed to take a seat. Ben thought briefly about pretending to pull up a chair of his own, but decided that it was just too ridiculous, so he simply sat down instead. The guy looked momentarily disappointed, then began rifling through papers that only he could see. Ben realized with dismay and a bit of anxiety that what he had taken for a mock business meeting was, in fact, a mock job interview. "So, Mr. Harrison," the guy began, looking down at his empty hands as if he were reading something. Then he looked up at Ben, raising his eyes without lifting his head. "Or is it Mr. Black?" Either one is fine," Ben answered nervously. "Don't be absurd," the man insisted, setting down his imaginary paperwork and addressing Ben directly. "Names are important. You must choose." "Black," Ben answered instinctively. "It's Black." "Excellent," the man said with a slight smile, and moved his hand as if he were jotting something down. "So, Mr. Black, I'm Mr. Greenman." He gestured in front of him, indicating the nameplate that didn't exist, on his desk that didn't exist. Then he continued, "I'm glad you could come in today." "Yeah, about that," Ben interrupted. "The crow that led me here." "Yes, what about her?" Greenman asked, sounding irritated that Ben had gone off on this tangent. "Was that really my crow?" Greenman looked appalled and, with an offended tone in his voice, proclaimed, "That was a very unenlightened thing to say, Mr. Black. She is her own crow. She belongs neither to you nor to anyone else." Ben felt oddly embarrassed. "No, I didn't mean it like that." Though he supposed maybe he had, and maybe it was rather unenlightened. "I just meant, was that really the crow that I know?" The guy started flipping through invisible papers again. "The one that you call Luna and that Mr. Weston referred to as Little Sister?" "Yes," Ben confirmed, wondering how in the hell this guy knew so much about his life. "Yes, that was her," Greenman stated. "She works for me sometimes. Freelance, of course. She's very independent, doesn't like to be tied down with contracts and the like." "Of course," Ben said, and immediately hoped that didn't come out sounding as sarcastic as it was. Greenman gave a quick nod as if to say that was settled, then looked back down at his paperwork. "Now, it says here that you need my help." Ben tried to think of a diplomatic way to say that the last thing he wanted was to get any more involved with this guy than he already was. But all that came out was, "You don't need my help?" Greenman asked, incredulously. Well, no, I don't think so." The guy gave him a knowing smile. "Well, Carrie certainly thinks you do." "What? You've spoken to her? She told you that?" Greenman chuckled lightly and a little condescendingly, which put Ben even more on edge. She didn't have to tell me. Believe me, she knows as well as I do that, even if you could pull off your little rescue mission, you simply don't have the time. Suddenly, the man was no longer wearing a suit but a lab coat, and there was a stethoscope where his tie had been. Now, when he spoke, his tone was one of detached sympathy. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Mr. Black, but without the proper treatment, Miss Morgan only has a few days to live." Ben was fully aware that Carrie's time was running out, but he didn't believe there was anything this guy could do to help him. He said, "Listen, Mr. Greenman." The man cleared his throat pointedly and tapped a finger on his stethoscope. "Dr. Greenman," Ben said, and it took all of his willpower not to roll his eyes. "I know Carrie's in bad shape, so unless you can get her out of that place, I need to get going so I can do it myself." Greenman didn't seem offended by Ben's bluntness. He just shook his head sadly and admitted, "I'm afraid that is beyond our capabilities. What we can do is give her more time." "How?" "With a transplant." Now Ben was certain that the man was full of shit. "Right," he said, and started to get to his feet. "It's the only way to save her," Greenman asserted, and there was something in his voice that made Ben stop. A hint of sincerity underlying all the pretension, maybe. Ben sighed and sat back down. "What do you mean by transplant?" "An energy transplant," Greenman replied, and now the doctor facade was gone and replaced by what appeared to be a college professor. He now had glasses and was wearing a slightly awkward-looking blazer with a brightly patterned sweater underneath. He turned his back to Ben and began writing in the air as if on a blackboard. "We all need sustenance to survive, correct?" he asked, and then just stood there with his hand held up above his head. "Right," Ben answered, realizing that the guy was not going to continue until he did. Greenman gave a slight nod, then the hand that had been frozen in place began scribbling in the air again. "But where Carrie is, there is no food, because it is not a place meant for living beings." He turned and gave Ben a smile. "Luckily, things don't work the same way there as they do in your world." Ben made a mental note of the fact that the guy had said your world, not our world. "Time is different there," Professor Greenman continued. "That's why she's survived as long as she has. Space is also different there, but that's beside the point right now." He said this last with a distracted wave of his hand. "It's not like I can take food to her," Ben interrupted. "I can't get there physically, and if I could, I would just get her out." Greenman pointed his imaginary piece of chalk at Ben and announced, "That's a very good point." Then he turned back to the board. "But what if there were another way?" He began pacing back and forth, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. "Humans and other animals eat food to acquire the energy that keeps their bodies alive. So what if—" He paused and appeared to be drawing some sort of chart on the invisible blackboard. "What if we could cut out the middleman?" "Okay," Ben said, feeling like maybe this was slightly less insane than he had initially thought. "I see what you're getting at. You're talking about me raising power and then transferring it to her, like the way Dion Dot transferred power to me." "That's right." "I still don't see how that would work," Ben said. "Wouldn't we need to be on the same plane of existence to do that? I'm like a ghost when I'm there." "Ah, good question," Greenman shouted and started scribbling in the air again. "And normally the answer would be yes. However, energy is not quite the same as matter. It can pass more easily from one realm to the next. All you need is something to act as a conduit." "Something like what?" Ben asked, berating himself for the touch of excitement he heard in his own voice. The blazer, sweater, and glasses were suddenly gone, and Greenman was dressed head to toe in green. He wore pants tucked down inside boots that appeared to be fashioned from large, thick leaves. His shirt was really more of a vest and was held together in the front by a small vine that served as a lace. "There are certain things that can breach the boundaries between the worlds," the man in green explained, and Ben was relieved to hear that he no longer sounded like he was playing a role. I happen to know of a certain object that could help you, if you're interested." "What is it?" Ben asked eagerly. "A flute," Greenman stated. Ben was, once again, convinced that this had all been a waste of time. "A flute?" he scoffed, not even attempting to hide his anger and frustration. The man's eyes flashed, and Ben realized that he wasn't as frivolous as he pretended to be. "You should understand better than most that it is often the things that seem the most ordinary that have the most power." Then he shrugged and smiled. "Besides, music can be a magical thing." "Okay, fine," Ben sighed. "Where do I get this flute?" Greenman's mouth turned up in a sly smile. "Well, that's going to be a little tricky. It's currently in the possession of someone who is very dangerous, and guarded by an animal who is perhaps even more dangerous." "What kind of animal?" Ben asked nervously. Greenman looked serious, more so than he had at any other point in their conversation, which made what he said next all the more absurd. "A great boar." Ben laughed aloud at this. "You want me to fight a pig to steal a flute?" Greenman gave him a disgusted look. "Not just any pig, and I highly recommend that you don't try to fight him." Ben pressed his palms into his forehead and then dragged his hands down his face in a gesture of utter exasperation. "Fine, Jesus. Just tell me where to find this damn flute, then." "Follow me," Greenman said, then made a dramatic sweeping motion with his hands and turned away. Ben followed him toward a small stream. Greenman stopped at the edge and held out his hand with the palm facing back toward Ben. As Ben drew up beside him, he wiggled the fingers impatiently. At first, Ben had no idea what the guy was doing. Then he realized that he was prompting him to take hold of his hand. Ben looked at him, eyebrows raised and drawn together. "Are you serious?" "Do you want to cross?" Greenman asked, imitating Ben's irritated tone. Ben reluctantly clasped his hand in Greenman's, and they crossed together. As they did, Ben breathed in a sharp, involuntary gasp. Everything was so bright that it seemed to be glowing with an internal radiance. The trees and plants were unlike any that Ben had ever seen, and they all appeared to be in bloom. The entire forest floor was covered in a strange, almost fluorescent green moss that was so thick and soft that it made Ben feel like he was walking across a bunch of pillows. It gave so much as he walked that it was a little difficult to keep his balance. "Where the hell are we?" he asked, completely awestruck. "Where do you think?" Greenman asked in return. "I don't know. It looks like fucking fairyland." "Well, there you go," the man answered, bopping Ben on the nose with his index finger, which gave Ben the nearly irresistible urge to punch him in the face. Then he turned and walked on. Ben took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind of the hate he was quickly beginning to develop, and followed behind him. After walking for a few minutes, they reached the edge of the trees and stepped out into brilliant sunlight. Ben found himself staring up at a sheer rock face that was so tall that he felt dizzy just looking at it. Between them and the cliff was a wide and fast-moving river. Greenman pointed upward to the top of the rock wall and stated, "That's where you need to go." "Okay," Ben agreed. "How do I get up there?" The guy looked at him as if he thought he must be joking, and when Ben didn't say anything, he finally answered, "You climb." Ben, who had never climbed anything more daunting than a flight of stairs in his life, said, No, there has to be another way around." "Afraid not," Greenman stated, sounding like this entire conversation were starting to bore him. Then he walked a little farther upstream. "Here's where you cross," he said, indicating a row of large rocks jutting out of the churning water. There were wide spaces between the rocks, and the water wound around them, creating tiny whirlpools where the streams joined back together. "You've got to be kidding me, right?" Ben snapped. "There's no way in hell I'm doing that." "Well then," Greenman responded with a frown, "I guess there's no way in hell you're going to help your girlfriend." "Shit," Ben growled, to no one in particular. He paced back and forth for a couple of minutes, looking out at the water and trying to convince himself that crossing it was something he was capable of doing. He tried not to even think about how impossible the climb up the cliff would be if he did make it across. Greenman was still just standing there, looking impatient and offering no advice whatsoever. Finally, Ben stopped pacing and spun toward him. "Okay, assuming I don't drown or fall to my death, how will I know where to go when I get to the top?" "Oh, you'll know," Greenman answered with a smile that Ben didn't care for at all. Then he said, "Safe travels," and began to walk away. "Wait, you're just leaving?" Greenman turned and gave him a look implying that this question was utterly absurd. "Why wouldn't I? You'll either survive or you won't." He gave a disinterested shrug. "I did my part. It's all on you now." Then he strode off into the trees.